Have you ever played a game that was built around an idea that probably sounded fantastic in a boardroom spoken about among people who don't play games, only for the product to be ultimately lesser because of it? Well, you see, for me, that seems to summarise Watch Dogs Legion perfectly. The third entry to the Watch Dogs series removed us from the first two titles' American settings of Chicago and San Francisco and dropped us in a near-future version of the English capital, London. Here, we can play as anyone, assume the role of whomever, and enact DedSec relevant shenanigans. Want to play as a suave spy? You can. Want to play as a foul-mouthed brickie? You can do that too. Want to play as a paramedic and defibrillate people's brains? Go for it. What about playing as somebody's nan, hobbling around to your heart's content? No problem. Watch Dogs Legion is built on the notion that you can play as anybody, literally any NPC you please, but what this gimmick painfully forgets to consider is what value does that actually bring? Watch Dogs Legion is one of those games that stinks of its own ruse of ambition. It's a game that, while not explicitly awful, fails to excel in any particular area. Instead, we're left with a gutted feeling version of the Watch Dogs gameplay we'd become accustomed to over the past two games, slotted into a generically formatted open world, and all there truly is to latch onto is this gimmick that, while technically impressive, is fundamentally useless, and only splinters the game into fragmented clumps that stoop cozily below the barrier of enjoyability. Watch Dogs Legion is a game completely ruined by the fact it was built on this idea, and nobody in a position of genuine creative control at Ubisoft had the sense to realise the trade-off they'd have to make to accommodate it just wasn't worth it. But beyond that ridiculous gimmick that I'm sure gave the board of directors a stiff one under that long executive fine oak desk, we have an open world built on irksome stereotypes that never fails to give me a headache. A cast of actors feigning British accents barely masking the fact that most of them are probably Canadian for cost-cutting purposes, and content that for the most part can be assorted into a series of uninspired categories. Then there's a random Stormzy collab. Why are you making me listen to this? Watch Dogs Legion is one of the most Ubisoft games you could possibly imagine. It's large, has competent-ish gameplay, albeit gutted when compared to previous entries to the same series, under the illusion of being deeper, content galore technically, and innovation in areas nobody asked for it, and no innovation where it actually counts, and none of its actual ideas are realised satisfyingly. Almost 5 years ago, when this game was new, I reviewed it and tried to be fair to it. But today, for some reason, virtually 5 years later, we're revisiting it. The game that effectively slaughtered a promising series with an impressive but redundant innovation because they didn't know what else to do with it. So today we're going to be exploring precisely why Watch Dogs Legion was a terrible idea. When it comes to international appeal, we all know the only place in the UK that exists is London, right? London is a massive cosmopolitan city that, much to the dismay of the rest of the UK, is the vibrant beating heart of our magnificent Isles. This isn't just an American or a non-British perspective either. London also likes to think London is representative of the whole of the UK, but I'm going to throw something out there. I'm absolutely sick of London. It doesn't help that I've never been swayed by the real place, but this city has such a grasp on the bollocks of portrayals of Britain, particularly England, in international media, and it's incredibly frustrating. I guess this isn't a fair critical point to direct towards Watch Dogs Legion, but it does mean that the setting, while it isn't in the US, isn't necessarily anything special either. I applaud Watch Dogs for venturing beyond the shores of the good old US of A. That within itself is a risk, one that I think Watch Dogs was better for taking, but London is the most desperately uninspired choice by default after the fact, because to many people in the world it's the only UK city they could name, and it really doesn't lack for adequate portrayals in media, including video games. But that does bring me to an actual gripe I can direct towards Watch Dogs Legion. It doesn't feel like a terrific portrayal. I mean, visually it's good, it's got all the landmarks, albeit slackered in propaganda as the country is portrayed as a fallen dystopia, so you'll barely see them, at least not until you do a bunch of bland side tasks to remove the holograms. The lighting is nice, particularly at night with the reflecting puzzles, courtesy of all the endless drizzle we get over here. The colour scheme screams London, and it's nice enough on that. It sparks memories of actually being in the capital, though I haven't been back in maybe 6 years. Then there's the people. Almost everybody's accent in this game feels incredibly fake. There are some bang-on ones amidst what I can only imagine is a sea of Canadian actors forced to imitate Brits under extreme duress while being pelted with peanuts by Yves Guillemot personally, resulting in an end-to-end verbal uncanny valley effect that kills any modicum of immersion Watch Dogs Legion might have clung to. I suppose we should have expected this when that initial announcement trailer for the game featured a clearly non-Cockney actor feigning a Cockney accent, overcorrecting badly and ending up Australian.
London. Had a good run there for a while.
For context as to how far off the mark that is, if you need a lesson in basic geography, this is where you'll find London, and this is where Australia is. You can tell when a voice is strained by using an unfamiliar accent versus when it's relaxed and allowed to sound authentic. There's a lot of dialogue that falls into the former camp in Watch Dogs Legion, sadly. I won't pretend there aren't an abundance of exceptions, such as Bagley, whose dialogue is standout in this game, but there are many characters whose voices appear to be strained, with cracks through which the speaker's native accent creeps in, and it's not the actor's fault. With the right coaching, enough time to prep and familiarise themselves not just with an accent, but the dialect itself, you'd be amazed at how faithful the results can be. But if you cut corners, skip the dialogue coaching, ask people to repeat lines in a voice booth until they hit something vaguely passable, it's going to come off as fake, and that's a barrier Watch Dogs Legion smashes into and bounces off of countless times. But the dialogue consists of more than just bad imitations of British accents and dialects. We're talking a chronic abuse of slang terms and purposeless swearing too. We do love a good naughty word over here, that much is very true. But we love to craft clever insults with them, the likes of which would detonate the American mind and otherwise weave vulgarity into a purposeful direction of language, but Legion's deployment is sloppy and excessive. That makes it grating as the swearing is often used as a substitute for intelligent words with actual meaning, because the characters have to be chopped and changed at the player's discretion.
I'm impressed with your squad. I'd like to join you and take back London, if you have me.
Fucking excellent. Welcome aboard.
Where is the impact in that? As for the slang, yeah, there's a lot of slang in the UK. It's regional, along with the accents and dialects, but Watch Dogs Legion has a tendency to portray this slang entirely scattershot, to the point where sentences verge on being incoherent. That's for the best, as the usage that isn't incoherent is painful.
You look hard. You thinking of taking back London?
Look, if you're foolish enough to try and spark up a conversation with a stranger, in London no less, I advise you find a better icebreaker than "you look hard." Deep dialogue just isn't written for a game with such a gimmick, so not only do we have a game trying to be region-specific with slang and dialect, not all of which is distinctly Londoner, with the express intention of cashing in on that as a novelty, it's trying to make all its dialogue inserts vague and generic as to function with a variety of faux character substitutions. Sometimes this goes as far as dialogue that needs to potentially fit in multiple situations. The end result is characters whose only discernible feature is a stereotype because their dialogue is entirely purposeless and doesn't interact with basic context. And it's very hard to wrap your head around this being an authentic British experience when the portrayal of the people is quite exaggerated to the point where it's a series of bad impressions with no depth beyond that because we aren't playing as characters. But the dialogue sometimes sounding forced as to be notable isn't London's only issue in this game. Another is the fact the city can't seem to get over itself, and that's perhaps the most inhibiting thing because that is not a problem you'll encounter in actual London. I'm talking an over-the-top deployment of Union flags which are wrong, and why the flag has changed isn't acknowledged. We can assume Scotland has left the UK, it's not a tricky conclusion to come to, there's no blue in it. But that isn't addressed at all, it's just the wrong flag for no reason. But that's besides the point. The point is, there is an over-the-top deployment of flags. I'm talking articles of clothing, things like that, things you'd expect tourists to wear. And you're telling me locals are cutting about in these without being cripplingly self-conscious of the fact that they look like a twat? Then there's this mug who defaults to having it tattooed on his face. Look, I love this country, but that's just a bit extreme, isn't it? The best way to describe London's portrayal in Watch Dogs Legion, it's as if the city is self-aware it's in a game that will score novelty points for being set here. Sure, there's a fairly faithful basic layout, the colour scheme seems on point, despite understandably not being a one-to-one recreation of the core of the city, it's incredibly faithful. Down to the iconic London taxis and red buses, the feel of the place isn't just captured adequately but competently. I'm not entirely convinced Ubisoft understood what all the road markings were supposed to mean, but that can be forgiven because neither do actual UK drivers at times. But what is a bit disappointing is the culture portrayal doesn't live up to the vibrant environment it occupies. Sure, you can get absolutely sloshed at the boozer, and the game refers to this on the map as getting pissed. And yes, you can make the fantastic choice of then playing darts while pissed. You can park in disabled bays without displaying a blue badge, and you can do keepy-uppies at the roadside to drown out the sorrows caused by the cost of living. And it's not necessarily wrong to portray us as a society of pint-sinking binge drinkers with an unhealthy tribal obsession with football, demonstrating underwhelming acts of rebellion, and communicating in reductive, broken, slang-infused English, but when that's all there is to show, the culture becomes a substitute for individual personalities. It's not intentional, it's just all there is to latch onto. And that doesn't help a game move past its locality being an obvious selling point. If you look at the marketing, should you make the ill-advised decision to take a shot every time the word London is mentioned, you wouldn't just be in hospital, you would die. Then if you remember the world premiere trailer where we saw the player somebody's nan mechanic and it turns out she's a retired assassin and she hobbles about and kills people with a silenced pistol while wearing a ridiculous mask, despite otherwise being dressed for bingo, you can tell it's a game designed with whimsy in mind. And that was probably more a mistake for the overall Watch Dogs franchise than it was for this particular game, but it does cut to the core of this issue in my opinion. And that is, Watch Dogs Legion's portrayal of this great city is inauthentic because it wasn't trying to be authentic. Problem is, that's a given for everything else the game has going on. The only reason the authenticity is a problem area for Watch Dogs Legion is it has no character to bind to. We aren't playing as a protagonist, we're playing as whomever. And this is not an area the previous Watch Dogs games had faltered in. Chicago in Watch Dogs 1 mirrors Aiden Pierce's dark, cold, very isolated worldview, and it's portrayed in a way that fits Aiden Pierce's narrative. You can believe that the environment would create someone like him, and that is ultimately its primary directive as a setting. Watch Dogs 2 San Francisco represents Marcus Holloway's more breezy approach, its laid-back nature by comparison. Again, the city is designed to show how a character like Marcus Holloway could be created. Furthermore, with Silicon Valley, it furthers the narrative of big tech doing unethical things right under people's noses to the point where it's spelled out for us, and yet nobody seems to really care. And Marcus's mission is to expose that. Watch Dogs Legion doesn't have a protagonist to attach to. The city isn't contributing towards emotional investment in a character, and the absence of said main character lessens the emotional connection between the players and the story too. All it can do is latch onto the outermost layer of the culture it's trying to represent and hope for the best, and that is precisely what Watch Dogs Legion does. I'd hazard a guess at saying that's the main reason the game isn't set in the US. North America is a gargantuan market for these kinds of games, and Watch Dogs Legion needed something that came across as novel to that set of sensibilities to disguise the game's total aimlessness. In other words, the game is set in London, so North Americans don't notice how deep it isn't. And I can't be the only one that feels as if the lack of depth in this game is obvious despite the surface level detail the world is absolutely packed with. You absolutely can learn a lot about this world space just by moving through it. The billboards tell us Stormzy is wanted for civil disobedience for some reason. You can find protest signs asking where the Queen went, though this game is set around 2029-ish, so with the benefit of hindsight we know that question has been answered for about 7 years. The vast majority of cars and buses driving around the city are entirely passengerless, they don't even have a driver, and I suppose self-driving cars for a near-future setting makes some kind of sense. However, we're not just talking these driver London taxis or the London taxis or indeed the buses, you know, the things that make sense to be about even without passengers. Even what I can only imagine are private vehicles are roaming the streets aimlessly with no driver. There's an easy identifier for this. On the windscreen there's an A symbol that will light up if the vehicle presently has nobody in it. But what that doesn't cover is why somebody's private car would be roaming the streets of London for no reason. You could certainly make an argument that maybe the cars aren't owned by any one individual and people can make use of them as and when, but that would imply they could stop them first. And also wouldn't necessarily explain why ambulances also have this feature, implying there are scenarios in which ambulances are driving around unmanned, so the patient might don't have to load themselves into it, or indeed the vehicle can be commandeered by anybody at any time. Furthermore, some of the vehicles that are self-driving themselves around London with no purpose aren't even electric. They have engines, they're old cars. Why would they be burning fuel if they're not transporting somebody somewhere? The point I'm trying to make is there are details in Watch Dogs Legion's world that provoke this near-future dystopia, but they don't necessarily all allow you to understand it, because a lot of the details don't even make sense. You have all sorts of vehicles driving themselves because Ubisoft couldn't be bothered putting passengers or even drivers in them, integrating them with routines as seen in Watch Dogs 2. Ubisoft treated predictions of turnover within the monarchy extremely conservatively, to say the least, though I can understand and appreciate that's probably more a taste thing, and I can respect that. But considering events since the game released, it is quite funny, because it leaves the suggestion that everyone in London is suffering from sudden bouts of dementia. The flag being wrong and that never being addressed can be lumped in here too. If you're going to fuck with a nation's identity for narrative purpose, fine. I'd even go so far as to say in this instance it would be a really cool detail if the game bothered to explore it at all. While we're at it, what kind of civil disobedience is an overhyped grime artist truly capable of? The side mission that expands on that showcases its celebrity placement for collaboration purposes. How does helping this man promote his music by hijacking a massive screen and broadcasting it to the unsuspecting people of London help liberate it in any way? And that mission gets sillier by portraying the man as some form of freedom fighter now. He fights for freedom by plugging his own tunes. But I can't say it's the worst Stormzy collab I've seen. That's got to be the Stormzy meal at Mackey's. I hear there was some political reason why people weren't happy about that. I'm not going to get into that, but my gripe was it was the most depressing order you could fathom. So yeah, Watch Dogs Legion's world is full of superficial details. Unfortunately though, a lot of them, however interesting, don't really attach to anything, and a lot of them otherwise don't make the slightest hint of sense. Then there are the details that you'd think would naturally carry over from previous Watch Dogs titles, but sadly just don't. For instance, the train from Watch Dogs 1 or the trams from Watch Dogs 2. You'd think for a game set in London that detail would carry over with the world-famous London Underground, affectionately known as the Tube. After all, being transported by rail was quite a vibe in the previous games. You'd be wrong though, the Tube isn't actually present, it's just a fast travel station. You use them to get around the city and it's instantaneous, you just teleport over. There's no train ride, nothing. This core element to London living is just not present in the game, and that's a massive waste. That would have scored some easy points, I'm sure. As for the whole paramilitary-controlled dystopia thing, that also struggles to be comprehensible in this world, and that's because it's pulling in two directions that oppose each other, and the results are more accurate than they have any right to be. On the one hand, the game is trying to portray Albion as this oppressive paramilitary force that has taken advantage of the disarray in London and seized total control, and by extension likely total control of the country. But good luck finding any mentions of what's happening in the rest of the country anywhere in the game. Albion has effectively become the police, the government, everything, and they oppress the working residents of London by doing random scan checks. They have checkpoints set up, and maybe sometimes they'll arrest people for vibes, but otherwise they heavily surveil a city that's already quite heavily surveilled. They seem to have effectively toppled the very function of a country that's existed for millennia, so it's incredibly awkward that in gameplay their competence goes entirely wonky, like they never planned on the radicalization of Barry the Brookie from Luton. But at the same time, while this menacing force is threatening the very liberties of an entire nation, you have the vast majority of people going about their routine like it's not going on, which is probably not entirely intentional. I'd imagine Ubisoft were most eager to have the city still function as one, but it oddly fits with how I'd expect the people of this country to react to such intense injustices, with total indifference. If that is intentional, it's a very convoluted way to accomplish what both Watch Dogs 1 and 2 already did. The whole charm of the previous two Watch Dogs games was the system was designed to make life better. The first game explores how it's highly flawed and susceptible to attacks. Otherwise it's quite light on the commentary, but it delivers a very plausible concept of a dystopia. Watch Dogs 2 bids to highlight how this technological age we've stumbled into, while convenient, is a hotbed for exploitation, and how giving away your data for the sake of these conveniences benefits the company offering you the convenience more than you accepting it. It's a world in which people's value has amounted to how much of a product they are, and that commentary hits harder and harder as the years go by, to the point where it feels in hindsight more like a warning. To both games, the similarity, that subtlety, was incredibly important. It's through that that one could come to the conclusion that reality isn't heading in a direction all that different. Going full dystopia isn't anywhere near as subtle, and the most impactful takeaway from it is that life goes on, which is something that Watch Dogs 2 in particular highlighted already. From that perspective, Watch Dogs sacrificed its nuance in exchange for no real benefit. It was a step backwards in the world the series was building. I really don't understand what Ubisoft were thinking when they traded something you could relate to in exchange for a far riskier dystopian society, while also sacrificing the concept of the main protagonist, detrimentally limiting the extent to which we can understand it. And that's what a lot of this game's world's issues can truly be traced to. We aren't observing it through the lens of a protagonist, and the world has to stand on its own. Therefore, the player isn't equipped to explore it in any meaningful way. So, it tries to just be, and that's not really enough. It tries to use its UK setting to be novel, in hopes it'll do enough to disguise just how flavourless it truly is, and maybe this is a UK-centric interpretation to acknowledge my own bias, but when you're familiar with everything the game is trying to portray, it comes across as grossly oversimplified, and it's annoying there's no genuine means through which it could be deeper. So let's tackle the big one, this game's main selling point. The thing the marketing was contingent on, the game is entirely reliant upon. The pseudo-innovation that is the idea of playing as anyone. Watch Dogs Legion's principal idea is the notion of being able to recruit anybody to DedSec. Anybody can be special and join the ranks of this secretive hacktivist organisation. The fact the system functions is a testament to itself. It's a complex thing, there's no denying it. Even if it does feel very simple, I can't imagine it was easy to do. We can see people in the world we've encountered before. We can save them to our recruits list, carry out missions to win them over and recruit them to our numbers, and then they come with their own benefits. Then we can play as these recruits, inhabit their very bodies and experience their pros and cons. It's interestingly done, and when you notice how elaborately explored I suppose it is, with our characters going about their routine when we're not overriding their brain, and transforming said routine into bouts of domestic terror, it's impressive in its own way. We can encounter them in the world living their lives, meaning we can bump into them both randomly and deliberately, and the same applies for any other character you either save or make an impression on before they disappear from eyeshot. Now, the trade-off to facilitate that system is sadly where the problem manifests. What does the play as anyone gimmick mean for Watch Dogs Legion? It means we have no main protagonist. We have characters such as Bagley, our AI, and Sabine who recruited us at the game's beginning, but the characters we recruit, play as and all that, they can only be skin-deep husks with voices that sometimes don't seem to match with their faces.
You look hard. You thinking of taking back London?
Their dialogue as a result is always either 100% on point in response to Bagley or Sabine's input, with very little actual character injection, or a sludge together of dialectal gestures that carry a general point or simply fill silence between Bagley talking and Bagley talking again. So that's your first sacrifice. Well-written, deep characters just don't exist in this game because the playable characters just objectively aren't deep, or even characters at all. And any other character we see largely only ever interfaces with what is just not a character in any sense of the word, so characters can't win. The limitations of the play as anyone innovation hits a hard ceiling here. It's like being able to visit 1,000 procedurally generated planets in Starfield. It sounds fantastic, until you realise 99% of what's out there is randomly generated from an assortment of criteria less expansive than initially promised. In a bid to make an experience more random and less contrived, procedural generation still has obvious limits, so you achieve the opposite. The same goes for Watch Dogs Legion's playable characters. You just aren't going to find anyone interesting. They don't exist. Their benefits exist entirely in their abilities, perks and all that, but how they interact with storytelling on any level is a total afterthought. Therefore, the entire story is an afterthought as well. Watch Dogs Legion's narrative is unique in its replayability, because it is actually replayable in the sense that by the time you finish the story, you've probably forgotten everything anyway. The general premise, however, is London got bombed by Zero Day, some mysterious, faceless, evil enemy who immediately obliterates the opening playable protagonist Dalton with a drone-mounted machine gun. Then, fast forward a couple of months, London is in total disarray. DedSec are on their arse, and now we get recruited by some DedSec character named Sabine. From here, we have to carry out the story while also recruiting people to the ranks, and here's how we do that.
You thinking of taking back London?
Why yes, I do happen to be thinking about domestic terror, this very second in fact.
You seem smart. Like someone who understands what's really going on here.
Oh, you're with DedSec. Oh, that's brill. I actually need your help with something.
That's not the sort of thing you disclose to strangers if I were in such an organization. What can I do for you?
It's Clan Kelly's thugs. They've lost the plot. A couple of them put my brother in hospital because they didn't like the look of him.
I'm really sorry to hear about that.
These are the most contrived conversations you could fathom.
Albion, fuck me, that's a relief.
Hey, it's all right. We're here to help. What's your problem?
I think I'm in trouble.
Now let's ignore just how terrible the dialogue is in these interactions. There are a few more hitches to this. For instance, the most common response to trying to interact with a stranger in London is being told to f**k off, and that's only taking into consideration the people who don't completely ignore you. So everyone being eager to join the ranks of DedSec isn't incredibly realistic. Secondly, hey you up for joining a hacktivist group systematically vilified for misattributed domestic terror offences is an incredibly tricky sell, so you end up doing some generated side mission to adopt members of the public to your ranks. However, it still feels shockingly easy to radicalise randomers. Radicalising randomers to DedSec's ranks also doesn't hit, because the randomers feel like the same rotation of about 10 people in various wigs and moustaches after enough time playing. The game doesn't explore its dystopia as to justify why more or less anybody can be convinced to fight against the system, which also exists in opposition to the fact that most people's lives seem unaltered by the madness, and then, when these characters are on board, they cannot develop in skill, nor can they really have any personality whatsoever, because they're just puppets with vague dialogue meeting purpose written dialogue, equally vague, as to not be too disjointed, and that's just nowhere near as intimate as meticulous storytelling. In gameplay, we don't get the extensive arsenal of Aiden Pierce or Marcus Holloway. We have maybe a couple weapons, some special perks and skills, and some gadgets, but nowhere near as much overall per individual as to make the gameplay feel as immediately varied, and the dynamism of that vigilante fantasy the other two games had is nowhere to be seen. It's fragmented across 16 personality voids, and that's the equivalent to not being present at all, as their connection is interrupted by a menu and a loading screen. The Play As Anyone feature has a net negative on anything beyond its own existence, which just so happens to be the rest of the game. It may be a cool idea to execute in a game, but it comes at the expense of characters, storytelling, and gameplay. It needs to wreck characters and storytelling, because no matter how good the system is, it can only ever be an illusion of the fantasy it's trying to sell, and needs technical shortcuts to work, and those technical shortcuts aren't subtle even in more accomplished and sensible applications of similar ideas. And it needs to wreck gameplay, because if any one character felt like the cohesive whole, the player would have a strong argument to ignore the system altogether. Then there's how the game handles deaths. There are two settings: permadeath. If a character dies, they're dead and that's that. You move on playing as somebody else, which sounds like a good idea if characters dying had any impact at all, which they don't, since they're not characters in the first place. The other mode is the one where being taken out in action results in a cooldown period on that individual, forcing you to play as somebody else in the meantime. It's bearable, and the odd character can still die if it's mentioned in their character's file at all, but it's still just slapping game logic on the situation and making the failure part of the gameplay loop at the expense of what might actually make sense. Meaning, you play as a character who has the traits to make the game most bearable, that character gets overwhelmed by big drones, and temporarily dies. Suddenly, you have to wait 40 minutes for the guy to recover from being shot to pieces, while you doss about playing as somebody as similar in capabilities as possible. And that utterly defeats the point of the system being present in the first place. But it's either that or risk permadeath and finding yourself with a series of fundamentally useless characters after all your handy ones have expired. Fortunately, Watch Dogs Legion isn't hard, but there's no middle ground for people who, though invested in the Watch Dogs series, didn't sign up for this nonsense. It's one thing to not compromise on vision, I get that. But what I struggle to fathom is what exactly the vision actually was. Are we just playing as anyone? That's not a vision, that's a vanity mechanic. It sounds good to a room full of men wearing suits taking themselves far too seriously. Above all else though, The inherent contrived nature of any game means such theoretically limitless features have significant limitations because otherwise they'll never be finished as the limit is perpetual. It has to exist and not exist simultaneously, and that is impossible. You have to compromise somewhere eventually, and usually when you do, you don't get as far as you think. Procedural generation is that gap, and while it can be randomized and mismatched to create enough variations to provide a system, eventually you'll start encountering the same voices, faces, style choices, skill sets, and the illusion of playing as anyone becomes exposed for what it actually is. You're not playing as anyone at all. I mean, you can technically, since there are special operatives who tend to be more visually interesting and designed purposefully. They're consistently more useful with their abilities, and include the likes of Wrench and Aidan Pierce, whose placement within London's DedSec ranks is grossly out of character, and that's before you customise him in cursed ways. There's a random assassin as well. These characters are infinitely more interesting than the usual. That doesn't mean they're remotely close to actually interesting in this setup. I'd imagine all these special operatives are DLC dependent, and thankfully I never had to pay for those because Ubisoft sent me a review code back in 2020, and that seemed to entail the full shebang. However, since the story isn't designed around a specific protagonist, they don't salvage the game from the issue its so-called innovation presents. They too feel vague and non-bespoke, and despite the likes of Aidan Pierce and Wrench being uniquely voiced, sometimes their dialogue is also just crap.
You the one looking for DedSec?
I know who you are. You can hide in plain sight from most people. Most people don't know what to look for.
Want to put your skills to good use? DedSec is always up for new blood.
Look, I've never really been into team sports, but I'm gonna be here for a while. And the truth is, I like your bartender. I used to help her out on a sort of contract basis. I could do the same for you. If you want.
I'm not going to pretend playing as Aidan Pierce doesn't make this game better, but you still have to overlook the fact that his character would never in a million years join DedSec. And then there's the fact that due to the player's anyone mechanic, his arsenal is nowhere near as expansive as it was in Watch Dogs 1, and if you make the mistake of taking him bare-knuckle fighting, you'll learn that in his 15+ years of experience as a hardened vigilante, he never learned the basics of hand-to-hand combat. You'd think after this long as the Fox, he'd have developed at least some kinesthetic control. And I get that he's considerably older by the events of Legion, but take into consideration his lifestyle, there's no reason why he wouldn't still be an absolute beast. So even if you take on the ultimate protagonist the series has given us, and by that I mean quite literally the first protagonist the series gave us, the experience is still considerably compromised by the player's anyone mechanic, rearing its hideous head. As a result, this is not Aidan Pierce, it's a bloke that looks and sounds like him, but isn't equipped to actually be him. I revoke him of his name. Henceforth, he will be known as Aaron Penetrate. I think you get the point I'm trying to make. There's the visage of a person that we do play as. They speak and interact. They technically aren't nobody, but they aren't somebody either. They're the same somebody as some other character. There's nothing inherently unique to them even in their application under our control. They are not actually entirely random. They are based on confined criteria that has explicitly been designed. The system has to work within those confines, so sooner rather than later, all the results it can generate start to homogenize until everybody in London feels the same. The system's biggest flaw is the fact that it exists, and it's simply not practical to manually produce an assortment of variables so expansive the algorithmic production of content starts to feel truly random to actually accomplish what it sets out to do, so it doesn't. So not only is Watch Dogs Legion depriving us of a main protagonist who truly is purpose written for this story, it's depriving us of the actual game's selling point. Does that make sense? The system is built on the misuse of procedural generation. It isn't actually that innovative. I'm hard pressed to imagine it was somehow harder than writing a fleshed out main protagonist to whom the world speaks to bed us into the setting and give us a perspective so we can actually understand and experience what the world might have to offer with a certain placement in mind, and have a story that works around that. So yes, you play as a soulless algorithmic creation that never needs selling beyond existing purely to move at the player's whim and carry out a bland assortment of objectives, while the sentient basement AI DedSec has laying around demonstrates far more personality than any of London's supposed actual people. All the while, the gameplay is entirely splintered across various playable character archetypes, resulting in an experience that goes wanting by comparison to the game's predecessors. So by comparison, your functions are limited. And by that I mean no character can be the complete arsenal. Sadly, the game makes a pig of highlighting the importance of that. So for the most part, provided you aren't playing as somebody with severe back problems and mobility issues, any playable husk will do for 99% of the game, except for when the story says no and sends you to recruit somebody specific, like an Albion operative to infiltrate an Albion area, which we've been doing for the rest of the game with just anyone anyway, or a brickie so we can just have a cargo drone, even though they're really not difficult to find. The game struggles to lend importance to our playable repertoire, so it forces us to use it to find specific individuals we don't actually need. The game just says we do, and when it's not actively doing that, we don't at any point feel like we need to go recruiting. Because once you've found a spy, a hitman, and somebody's nan, you, my friend, are sorted. As for how this ill-conceived mechanic affects the story, I've already gone over how it throws a hand grenade in the character department, but there are other ways through which the narrative is entirely detonated. The main one I can think of is the zero-day plotline that underpins the entire story. Zero Day is an anonymous extremist who believes destruction is the answer to London's woes, and it's for their actions that DedSec is framed. So understandably, a lot of the plot focuses on uncovering Zero Day's identity. Since we can play as virtually anyone we can encounter, at least we know it's not going to be somebody random. Of the characters that are actually characters, we have Bagley, who isn't a real boy, so he's out. We have Sabine, who recruits us as new members. It probably wouldn't make sense to be her. And then aside from the characters who dip in and out of the plot and therefore it wouldn't make sense to be them, you have the villains who are outwardly doing villainous stuff, so it would make sense to be none of these people. Obviously, Zero Day's not somebody you can recruit because that would end the story. So identifying who it is, regardless of whether or not it makes any sense, is relatively straightforward. It's Sabine. She's the only character who isn't outwardly against us. She's the reason DedSec is still going in London. Now the reason for that is explained away that she recruited members to DedSec to arm Zero Day, even if they didn't know it. And I suppose there's some logic to that. Her character does a 180 from diligent, righteous leader to twisted and evil sociopath quicker than you can say the words generic plot twist. But what annoys me about this is just how much priority the player's any one mechanic actually took over the overall game and the storytelling, to the point where the process of elimination can be reliably deployed to see this coming. In hindsight, the main menu spoils it. Sabine's at the top with all the villains and Dalton who gets yeeted immediately. I despise this menu formatting, by the way. It looks cheap and tacky, but let's get back to what I'm actually trying to talk about. The Zero Day mystery was a non-starter in this story. It was predictable not because it wasn't at least semi-competently executed, but because there was truly nobody else it could possibly have been. And the only reason that's not obvious to the characters we've recruited is because to them the player's any one mechanic doesn't exist. They are separate individuals, or at least that's what they're supposed to be. So it makes sense for the story, but it isn't necessarily satisfying to see play out. Because as you whittle down the suspects as the game goes on, you find yourself screaming at your screen that Zero Day's true identity is blatantly obvious, that you actually stop paying attention to Bagley and the cast of non-characters still fumbling, working it out. It is incredibly annoying to know something that none of the characters do for so long. It quite possibly would have been more satisfying if Zero Day was revealed to be Stormzy, and stopping Zero Day is the culmination of the plot, so it ends in the dumpster. Rather unceremoniously at that. As for another thing that bothers me about Watch Dogs Legion's story is it can't seem to figure out what tone it wants to go for. When you've got an idea for the core of your story, the central protagonist, it's a lot easier to decide what tone fits that character best, and therefore will likely fit the story best as well. Now, I'm not saying I have the faith in Ubisoft to not balls that up. They have done. Spectacularly. When you don't have that core anchor, it's a lot easier for the story to become aimless. Watch Dogs has never been able to identify a tone to carry the series. And that's obvious from the previous entries. Watch Dogs 1 was very serious. It's an action-packed, dark, brooding revenge thriller through and through. That's what Aiden Pierce's character needed it to be. Watch Dogs 2 pulled in the polar opposite direction. It's a considerably more light-hearted approach to this interconnected world. Marcus is nowhere near as jaded, as broken, and yet in a way it feels as if Watch Dogs 2 was perhaps a bit too light-hearted. The result of that is two games in the same series that appeal to very different people, or different dimensions to the same people. But when the time came for Watch Dogs Legion to choose between those two tones to go for, the decision was to somehow try and blend the two. So you have a story that takes itself quite seriously in a deeply whimsical parody recreation of London. It's trying to capture both trains of thought they applied to the previous two games. They want the thriller of Watch Dogs 1, and they want the light-hearted charm of Watch Dogs 2. If you execute that with absolute precision, there's a chance you can get it right. But as we've already explored, precision really isn't Watch Dogs Legion's strong suit. In the serious department, we're trying to rescue London from the brink of utter societal collapse. It's a race against time to loosen the hooks of Nigel Cass's Albion's utter domination of the city and by extension the country, and there are some very interesting and even sinister ideas explored along the way. Amidst the nonsense, I genuinely was taken aback by the mission coming home. From a gameplay perspective, it wasn't the most captivating, but from a narrative perspective, it stands out for being truly harrowing. It explores the horrors of achieving immortality through transhumanism, the thought of a consciousness being separated from their own body and uploaded to a computer, navigated from the perspective of somebody who doesn't want this fate. She wants to die, even with the noble intention of enabling somebody to live forever. Technology has equipped us to produce horrors, and we get to experience the horror of a woman separated from her own body, and slowly but surely inhibited to the point where she's little more than a slave, whose autonomy is dependent on the computer's user. Even through all this and all the pain, the House AI still finds a way to beg us to end her. My realization is there's always a less dignified way to die, and one way or another we as humans are stubborn enough to find it. I've skipped over a lot of details in this mission, but if the storyline was end-to-end of this quality, and moreover this integrity, it would have been utterly fantastic. A lot of the missions, however, are simple: infiltrate an Albion or Clan Kelly area, do something and escape. The quality gap is utterly palpable. And then, not so much in the main story, but certainly in a lot of the side stuff, and the general world as a whole, we've got to deal with a lot of silly. Furthermore, could you imagine playing as somebody's nan and doing this mission? The game actively provides the player with the tools to undermine the gravitas of its most impactful moments with joke characters. But hey, I suppose that's avoidable. I just think in Watch Dogs Legion, you're given an out too readily from the impact of certain events. But I can't help but feel as if that's compromised anyway, since these moments are preceded and followed by and otherwise blended with a less than riveting gameplay loop. No clear protagonist to observe this through the unique lens of, and Bagley's never-ending tension-breaking wisecracks.
Well, the mission we retroactively named Operation Let's All Traumatize Ourselves in Sky Larson's Fun Dungeon was a complete success, and I've just decoded her secret hiding place.
And you know what? I'm not even mad at that last part. Bagley is single-handedly this game's story's saving grace. That AI may as well be Watch Dogs Legion's actual main protagonist. His jokes don't necessarily land all the time, they aren't always welcome, sometimes they entirely self-destruct the moment, but for the most part he has the strongest dialogue and it's his voice that we're going to hear the most.
You're more likely to hurt yourself if you play darts while drunk, but let's be honest, that'll be hilarious.
So either the storytelling got at least something right, or it just ballsed up everything else to the point where something that should have just been there was more notable than it had any right to be. With the inclusion of a side mission that goes over his origin, ironically, despite just being a computer program, Bagley is perhaps the most human character in the entire game. And there was certainly some intention behind that. Bagley's role is critically important to Watch Dogs Legion, but there's something depressing about this game's most fleshed out character being an artificial intelligence. It shines a glaring spotlight on how the player's any one feature completely erodes character work, and more than anything, his wisecracks serve as a reminder of how few characters there actually are. But who cares? We can recruit the unemployed lunatic screaming into a traffic cone on an empty street. But that's what happens to a story when the bulk of the bandwidth is clogged up by an unnecessary concept of a system that nobody asked for. Everything else ends up as simple as possible. And if you want another example of that, look at the hierarchy of gangs in London. At the top of this hierarchy we have Clan Kelly. And that's literally it. The population of Greater London is approximately 9 million people, and I can't imagine that by the events of Watch Dogs Legion it's somehow shrunk considerably. I have a very hard time believing there would only be the one organised criminal syndicate. Watch Dogs 2 had its fair share of gangs, constantly in contest with one another, tearing up the streets, and Watch Dogs 1 also explored its own criminal web. Are you telling me a city with 10 times the population of San Francisco only has one gang to worry about? Worse yet, it's headed by somebody I can only describe as an EastEnders character? By comparison to Watch Dogs 1 and 2, this is ridiculously simpler. Almost as if the whole gangs thing was a corner cut for some reason. Sure, Mary Kelly's a ruthless, twisted woman. You can understand how she rules with fear and all that. The game gives you plenty of ammunition to absolutely despise her. But why does all of London's criminal underworld conform to her organisation? It strips it of any complexity it could have had. So we end up with an evil for the sake of it minor antagonist, and don't really get much if anything beyond her in that department. Sure, we have DedSec, who are also criminals by definition, but we belong to them, they don't count. The only other qualifying party is Zero Day, who is absent as Zero Day at least for the bulk of the story, so again, really hard to factor. In the end, Clan Kelly serves as another example of just how much of Watch Dogs 1 and 2 had been simplified, to the point where it feels it was no longer trying to be interesting. It's very much so like the time and resources went elsewhere. I have no idea where. Again, you can see how Watch Dogs Legion's central gimmick wholly dismantles any prospect of London having intricacy. Everything's cheapened and lessened down to the essentials and nothing more, and that completely corrupts almost every facet of this game. And what makes the player's anyone idea itself flawed is, it exists in polar opposition to the illusion that games serve to create. What I mean by that is nothing in a game is real anyway. The most convincing games bid to elaborately disguise that as carefully and purposefully as possible. This is why, if the storytelling is of importance, you have a set protagonist, a character who's been written meticulously to convince you they're an actual person who exists in this world. And this is one of the many ways in which a game can ensure it's not constantly reminding you that your escapism isn't real. Inversely, playing as randomly generated characters who don't necessarily feel real is going to accomplish the opposite. That effort is now spread across countless variations, and in failing that, it's entirely absent because that's what the system is designed to disguise. The Play As Anyone system is a constant reminder of Watch Dogs Legion's lack of authenticity, achieved through meticulous, painstaking, particular construction, and despite trying to use its systems to be more spontaneous to give you that sense that no two playthroughs are the same, it becomes no more real as a result of these misguided efforts. It's just as much an illusion as a traditional story would be, but at least with more standard storytelling and an actual established protagonist, there's a chance you might get invested. But this is the sort of gamble you take when you're implementing such a thing into a fully realised open world game where nothing like it had ever been seen before. You either strike gold and become a pioneer, even if the results aren't a straight 10 out of 10, the realisation of it as is could still be oozing with potential, or you discover precisely why nobody had done it before. Legion's central selling point is absolutely the latter. Now, to round off the video, I think it's best I do talk about gameplay in a vacuum. You see, Legion's gameplay is severely hampered by its dominant mechanic's vanity, but it's also not too grand on its own. The best way to describe it is to imagine the gameplay loop of the previous Watch Dogs games, but make it worse. Legion's gameplay is much simpler, less functional, and considerably stripped back. The driving is an area people still despise. I find it to be fine, but driving on the correct side of the road confused me far more than it probably should have. But these days, unless I find something egregious, I'm quite lenient with game driving. I find there's only so much you can accomplish in that department with a controller. The parkour is a far cry from the smoothness of Watch Dogs 1 and certainly lacks any morsel of the expressionism of Marcus's movement in Watch Dogs 2. It's simply climbing up things, vaulting low obstacles, jumping over gaps and jumping down. But the snazzy flips and the sense of flow from the predecessors are entirely gone, and the only addition is the ability to climb drain pipes. The combat is also worse with the unnecessary addition of health bars, which only serve as an excuse for headshots to not be instantly fatal, and I really don't understand why Ubisoft had such an obsession with them. The arsenal we can carry is also vastly reduced when compared to Marcus's and Aiden's. Characters can only use select weaponry and can only carry so many tools or have so many special abilities, meaning there's no broader cohesion where you apply every skill in a short time frame, defeating the point of having that variation for the sake of artificially making the player's any one mechanic appear useful, when the reality is the characters are just more individually useless. As for hand-to-hand, rather than the quick, snappy, close-quarters takedowns the previous titles had made us familiar with, we have to wear down the health bar of our opponent. This means engaging a character head-on can result in a total breakdown of the gameplay flow, as you're constantly blocked because your character keeps deciding to use the same move, which is impossible to avoid, forcing you to drop back and shoot the guy. I'll say it's quite nice that enemies seem to employ reasonable force. If you engage an Albion soldier in a fist fight, they'll only use fists rather than resort to firearms, which is a nice touch, but it doesn't make the incredibly limited set of combat animations any more interesting, which is a huge flaw in the underground bare-knuckle fights you can engage with. They're just not built on a good system. Then there's something that became my favourite part of the game for some reason.
DedSec Spider.
I do not know the practical application of this Spider-Bot invention, but the Spider-Bot can face-hug people to sleep and hack stuff. He's a cool guy. I can't knock him. What I can, however, knock is the hacking front, though. Watch Dogs Legion is noticeably less interactive than Watch Dogs 2 overall. You can no longer hack traffic lights, raising bollards are much less common, there's less world interaction for distraction purposes, and most hackable objects tend to be in restricted areas and mission confines where you can set traps and lure enemies to those traps, create distractions through abstract means, and yeah, that's kind of it. The only other things are means through which you can get money, like hacking a gambling machine or hacking an ATM. Legion's world otherwise is just less interactive through the series' actual selling point of hacking it. In fact, I don't think prior to bringing this up I've mentioned the hacking in the game much at all, which tells you just how far down the priority list making London a dynamic weapon in its own right had become, which exists in stark contrast to the setup scene in Chicago and San Francisco. It's disappointing that it feels like there's less to hack. It's equally disappointing that the breadth of what you can hack is still limited by your progression, by what skills you unlock. It doesn't feel like my arsenal is expanding and improving, it feels like initially it's limited. And then there are the puzzles, which are disappointing because they're the same puzzles from Watch Dogs 1 and Watch Dogs 2. And I understand it, if they aren't broke, don't fix them, but whose idea was it to put one in the middle of a boss fight? Now, I'll tell you what is weird. Stealth is an area of gameplay oddly unhindered by this limitation. Playing stealth in Legion is actually satisfying. Particularly thinning the ranks in a restricted area without being seen can certainly be quite enjoyable, but certain characters make lighter work of it than others, and sometimes takedowns just convert to punching a guy in the face because the game thinks you want to attack him outright. So you've got to be slow, methodical, craftily deploy traps, and use the phone-buzzing distraction cheese to close gaps. Except now you've got to be mindful of an overabundance of massive drones with machine guns, the little drones that can alert enemies to your presence and also carry some weaponry themselves. And I'll say this about the sci-fi that allows these drones to exist: there is nothing less interesting than fighting drones. Largely though, Legion's gameplay is hindered by its uninspired mission design. The bulk of a playthrough is defined by infiltrating a restricted area, getting to a certain point, doing a certain thing, and then escaping, which every now and again does the trick, but for the bulk of missions it starts to get really quite boring. This format is heavily present in main missions, side missions, recruitment objectives, and in the open world if you wish to do the restricted areas. It's completely dull, but that doesn't mean it's not enjoyable to switch your mind off and do. Too much of Watch Dogs Legion, though, is tailored towards making the player entirely disassociate with the experience. I can't for the life of me understand why the game was made this way. On the topic of side content, I've already gone over darts and keepy uppies, and a lot of side missions do fall into the mission design slump, but every so often there's a half decent one. Then there are the Parcel Fox side jobs, where you earn a bit of extra dosh for driving around the city delivering parcels, while Albion suddenly becomes exponentially more aggressive, like Nigel Cass has a personal vendetta against this universe's Jeff Bezos equivalent. The pay for doing these jobs is pathetic though. You get no benefit over just finding money you can hack into your bank account in the world space, and it takes much longer to do on average than run around finding these map-marked money drops. You can also cut about the city removing Albion propaganda, which is just as uninteresting as it sounds, really. You can graffiti walls in an equally mundane fashion, though you do get some say on what gets put there. One thing I will say is the pool of side content feels constricted when compared to Watch Dogs 2, which had a lot to get along with. Driver San Francisco jobs no longer exist. You can simply steal Driver London self-driving cabs that have no driver's seat anyway, or self-driving black cabs, but there's nothing you can do with them. A lot of Watch Dogs Legion's content falls into typical Ubisoft categories of meaningless, repetitive, arduous chores that don't really engage the brain once you look past the posted side missions themselves. Though the serious overlap in design philosophy more often than not doesn't exactly help this virtual recreation of London become memorable. Curated activities that remove you from the loop of the main game are uncommon, so it doesn't live up to the side content purpose outside challenging yourself to doing keepy-uppies, which requires you to press a rotation of 5 buttons in a fairly relaxed quick-time event that only becomes increasingly irregular the longer you last, but doesn't necessarily become challenging, only more fiddly. Darts is also quite straightforward. Your reticle is a circle that grows and shrinks in real time, and your job is to get the circle to become as small as possible and aim for a specific spot on the board, and once the small circle and the portion of the board you need line up, you throw. It's simple, fun for a whole 5 minutes, but like keepy-uppies, you really can't picture a casual player engaging with it twice. Or maybe you can, once sober and once drunk. But aside from making the screen go funny, there's no real difference. On the topic of alcohol though, I suppose drinking yourself into a stupor is its own kind of content. You can literally drink until your operative is no longer available, triggering a cooldown. I've already highlighted that bare-knuckle boxing is built on a poor, simple, unvaried hand-to-hand combat system that breaks down the flow of gameplay, so they find themselves being utterly unchallenging routines of dodging and striking, with the same 2 or 3 finishes 20 times in a row, and that's kind of it. There's also a guard break, but it's useful maybe a fifth of the time. Then there are the recruitment missions. They're somewhat farcical. Now that doesn't help when I'm already unconvinced by the system that renders recruitment missions necessary, but they're tedious, often an assortment of gradually repetitive objectives to help a friend of the potential recruit. These missions can easily be bollocksed right up, and then your candidate will dislike DedSec, which means you'll need to do more assisting to recruit them. I get that just walking up to people in the street saying you want in, and then them accepting would be more forced than having some trust-building exercise, but having to do this dance several times over is equally time-consuming and irksome, especially when sometimes you do these recruitment objectives because the game locks you out of progression until you find a specific operative, and the rewards for doing this casually when not playing on permadeath are negligible if not non-existent. The only thing you might hope to gain from it are finding interesting operatives like a hitman, or a spy, who just happen to be about and willing to join DedSec, only for them to go on to play 95% identically to every other operative you have who doesn't have lumbago. Now, overall, I'm not trying to portray Watch Dogs Legion's gameplay system as incompetent or bad, it's just really mediocre when compared to previous entries to the same series that achieved everything the gameplay here is trying to do but better, and even then, they weren't the complete article. Watch Dogs Legion in the gameplay department, among others, was a total step in the wrong direction. It plays like a cheaper, vaguer version of Watch Dogs, and that is incredibly difficult to praise in any meaningful way. And that brings me to this little revisit's conclusion. Watch Dogs Legion is built almost entirely around its central idea, its marketing ploy, the illusion of playing as anybody, and instead of becoming a pioneer in the open world game landscape, it is a beaming example of exactly why it's the first to do what it does, because doing so was a dismal error in judgment. The rest of the game had to be moulded around this system. The story had to be extensively simplified and made vague to accommodate no fixed protagonist. The world is just there and doesn't advance any commentary. It doesn't even make sense, it's just a playground to account for being whomever. The gameplay had to be simplified in every direction. The simplicity is hardly disguised by the setting's attempt to cash in on foreign novelty to the US market. It's no terrible game. Ubisoft are masters at competently making games, but somehow forgetting to inject any soul into them. But the Play As Anyone feature absolutely was a terrible idea, because it blows the illusion wide open and exposes how bare bones of a game Legion truly was. It's hard to like Watch Dogs Legion. It makes itself hard to like. Efforts that could have gone into a competent Watch Dogs 3 were instead redirected into fashioning a vain attempt to stand out that technically did, but I can't see how anybody could have viewed this as a step forwards. Watch Dogs Legion doesn't reinvent the open world genre with this. It didn't innovate to give us the Play As Anyone feature, it simply uninvented the main protagonist and didn't actually find a way in which that worked effectively, so they hammered the rest of the game to fit, and that is why Watch Dogs Legion was a bad idea. And there hasn't even been a Watch Dogs game since. Maybe there never will be again, which would be sad. It would be sad to see this series fade into obscurity, having never really found its footing, when the ideas of the first game are still an untapped goldmine. Will we ever see what's down there, what's possible in this world now? I have no idea. But if the series never goes anywhere again, it would be a shame to see it expire on this sour note. Legion could have been more. It could have been a fully fledged Watch Dogs 3. It could have disregarded the idea of playing as anyone, a concept it could never live up to, given us a protagonist through which the world and story speaks to us, and it would have been infinitely better. The gameplay wouldn't have had to be moulded around a value pit system that isn't anywhere near as complex as it wants you to think it is. But Ubisoft being Ubisoft, they went in a different direction, and that's a bit of a shame. Anyway, chances are good you're tired of my rambling, so I thank you for watching, listening, or simply zoning out to me as background noise. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated, and with any luck, I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point. But until next time, please take care, and goodbye.